Hey friend, welcome to True Crime Whispers Before Sleep. I'm really glad you're here. If you enjoy true crime stories told in a calm and relaxing way, you'll feel right at home. Before you get too cozy, tap that like button and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chilling case. And if you feel like it, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's story. It was a sweltering July afternoon in Dublin, Georgia, the kind of day when time seems to drip instead of tick. On Sycamore Lane, the air hung heavy with stillness. Lawns shimmered in the heat, shutters clung to shadows, and silence, like an uninvited guest, settled over the neighborhood. But that silence was about to be broken. A lone motorcyclist rolled past the quiet row of houses, his engine rumbling against the backdrop of cicadas. He slowed as he caught something in his periphery, something that didn't belong. A shape, motionless, in the yard of an ordinary house. He stopped, pulled over, looked again. What he saw, he'd never forget. A man lay face down on the lawn like a discarded doll. No movement, no struggle, just stillness. Too still. The motorcyclist pulled out his phone, voice tight with panic, and called for help. Within minutes, patrol cars rolled in. Flashing lights colored the street in red and blue as first responders stepped onto the lawn. And that's when the horror began to unfold. The man on the ground was beyond saving. His face was bruised and swollen, his limbs unnaturally stiff, and crawling insects marked the time that had passed since death. But it wasn't just the bruises. The back of his head bore a dark circular wound, clean, decisive. A gunshot. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't heat stroke or a fall or a medical emergency. This was execution. As paramedics stood back, officers began to ask the first of many questions. Who was this man? What happened to him? And why here? Why this home? But that answer was already waiting, just beneath the surface. A name would soon rise. A story would begin to bloom from blood-soaked soil. His name was Daniel Rayburn, 40 years old, a father, and the homeowner of the modest property now roped in yellow tape. To the neighbors, he was quiet, kept to himself. But recently, things had changed. Raised voices, movement at odd hours, visitors they didn't recognize. And then there was the woman. A woman seen often, sometimes yelling, sometimes crying, sometimes just staring from the porch. She was younger than Daniel, early 30s, long dark hair, a permanent storm in her eyes. Her name? The neighbors weren't sure. But detectives would soon learn it. Nicole Woodard. In the hours that followed, investigators moved quickly. The yard was photographed, evidence was bagged, and Daniel's lifeless body was taken to the county coroner for autopsy. Meanwhile, officers turned their attention to the inside of the house. They expected signs of a break-in, struggle, maybe a weapon left behind. Instead, they found nothing. No shattered glass, no overturned furniture, no blood trails, just silence. But tucked inside one of the drawers, a letter, a name. Brenda Lee Nicole Woodard, his wife. And just like that, the story shifted. This wasn't a home invasion. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was domestic. At that very moment, another piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Unexpectedly, in a different part of town. At the local hospital, a woman had been admitted hours earlier. She'd suffered a seizure while working at a nearby Applebee's. The staff had noted something strange. Her hands shook, not from illness but from nerves. Her pupils were wide, her speech fragmented. On her chart, Nicole Woodard, 37, the same woman, the same name. The timing was almost too perfect. Hours after her husband was found beaten and shot, She collapses in public, drawing sympathy and potentially building an alibi. Coincidence? Detectives didn't think so. Nicole was brought in for questioning when she was deemed physically stable. At first, she was cooperative, calm even. But beneath the surface, a storm brewed. Her voice trembled when she answered simple questions. Her eyes darted from wall to wall. She kept asking the same thing. Am I in trouble?
Detectives watched her closely. Not her words, but her pauses, her breathing, the cracks between the answers.
When asked about the night before, she claimed she and Daniel had been drinking. An argument started, heated, ugly, but nothing violent. She left. That's all she remembered. But nothing about her tone suggested grief. No tears, no outrage, just a vague detachment. As if she were remembering someone else's story, as if the body on the lawn had never been hers to mourn. They released her that night. Not enough evidence yet. No confession, no weapon, no surveillance, just whispers. But detectives weren't done. They returned to Daniel's property one final time, scanning the ground inch by inch, and that's when they saw it. A dreadlock, short, curled, recently torn out. It didn't belong to Daniel, and it didn't match Nicole's hair type either. There was someone else, someone close, someone violent, someone who bled rage into the grass of Sycamore Lane. By the next morning, the heat hadn't lifted. Georgia's summer had a way of wrapping around the lungs, making it harder to breathe. But detectives had no time for weather. They were back at their desks before the coffee had cooled, sifting through witness reports and trying to make sense of the night Daniel Rayburn died. Nicole was quiet, too quiet. Her answers hadn't added up, and her nerves were trembling through the cracks in her voice. And now, they had a clue. A severed dreadlock, proof that someone else had been at the scene. It was time to widen the circle. The call came in just after 10 a.m. A woman named Misty Edge had something to say. She wasn't just a name, she was someone close to Nicole, a friend, a co-worker, someone who had seen Nicole after the murder and could no longer carry what she knew. When detectives arrived at Misty's home, the air was thick with tension. Misty stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face pale. She looked like someone who had been holding her breath for too long. Nicole had shown up at her door early in the morning after Daniel's death. She hadn't called ahead, hadn't knocked politely. She just walked in, shaken and wild-eyed, carrying multiple bags and speaking in fragments. Misty described her as nervous, unstable, not like herself. Her hands trembled as she handed Misty a few things she couldn't explain. A shirt, a pair of shoes, a bag with something heavy in it. She hadn't wanted to open it, didn't need to. She could feel the truth without seeing it. Nicole, she said, looked haunted. Her body was there, but her mind was far off, trapped in a moment she couldn't escape. Then came the words, "He's gone," Nicole had said. "He was lying there. I didn't know what to do. I needed someone." And then almost under her breath, "They said they'd help me." Misty asked who she meant. Nicole didn't answer. She just sat on the couch, shaking, until the sun rose high enough to light the room in a way that made it harder to lie. Detectives leaned forward. "Did she tell you who she called?" Misty hesitated, then nodded. "She told me she made a call, said she needed help getting Daniel to stop, said someone was coming over. 2 of them. They'd take care of it." And then came the detail that shifted the case from suspicion to conspiracy. Nicole had said she wanted Daniel gone. She hadn't just witnessed what happened, she had set it in motion. Back at the precinct, detectives pieced together a growing timeline. Nicole and Daniel fought. Nicole left. Then she called someone. Then Daniel ended up dead. The dreadlock on the lawn, the seizure at Applebee's, the early morning visit to Misty. It was all there. The edges of the story beginning to close in. They pulled Nicole back in. This time to her sister's house. This wasn't an interrogation. It was a conversation at first. Quiet, measured. But they were watching her closely. The way her hands fidgeted. The pauses between her words. The way she answered things before they even asked. She said she hadn't touched Daniel. That she left the house after their fight. That someone else must have come after her. But detectives weren't buying it. She kept talking about her past with Daniel. About how he yelled. How they fought. How he broke her down in ways that didn't always leave bruises. Her voice cracked when she spoke about it. But not the way sorrow breaks a person. More like frustration. More like control slipping through her fingers. She denied everything, then admitted a little, then circled back. But eventually, the pressure chipped away at her walls. "I called Brian," she said. "I told him Daniel was losing it. I needed someone to calm him down." Detectives nodded, pressing gently. "And did Brian come?" A pause, then a whisper. "I think so. I don't know if it was him or Francis, but someone showed up. I didn't stay. I left." And then, Nicole didn't answer. Because deep down she knew. She knew what silence sounded like when it meant something had ended. The detectives didn't need her to say everything. They just needed her to say enough. Nicole sat in the back room of her sister's house, knees drawn close to her chest, arms wrapped tight around herself like she was trying to hold in a confession. The officers across from her didn't raise their voices. They didn't throw accusations. They simply waited. Pressure doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And under the weight of their silence, Nicole began to unravel. She spoke in fragments. Sentences cracked open like broken eggs, leaking truth between vague denials and breathless corrections. She hadn't planned anything, she said. She just wanted it to stop. Daniel yelling. Daniel threatening. Daniel being Daniel. "I couldn't take it anymore," she murmured. "I needed help." Help, the detectives reminded her, usually doesn't involve phone calls made at midnight. Help doesn't arrive with dreadlocks left behind and bodies riddled with bruises. "Did you call Brian?" "Yes." "Did you tell him to come to the house?" I said I needed him to calm Daniel down." "Did you know what that meant?" "No." "Are you sure?" "Maybe." She blinked fast. Her eyes shone, but no tears came. "Maybe I knew," she whispered, "but I didn't say the words." But sometimes, it's the silence that speaks the loudest. The name Brian led them to Brian Francis, a man with a criminal record thick enough to be measured in inches. Assault, weapons, one case of aggravated battery that never made it to trial. Now in his 30s, Brian had a reputation for solving problems the street way, quick, dirty, and final. Then came Andrew Huber, a quieter figure. No long record, but a shadow in Nicole's circle. He worked odd jobs, rarely stayed in one place, and always seemed to show up when things went wrong. The phone records confirmed what Nicole had hinted. She called Brian just after midnight. Another call went to Andrew's number an hour later. A timeline was forming, a rope tightening. They brought Nicole in again, this time for a formal interview at the station. Her story didn't change much, but her delivery did. Less rehearsed, more shaken. She kept reaching for the edge of the table like she was drowning in her own breath. She said she called them to calm Daniel down. She didn't ask them to kill him, didn't tell them to do it, didn't expect it, but she didn't stop it either. "I didn't say hurt him," she told detectives, "but I didn't say don't either." Intent doesn't always need words.
Sometimes it lives in silence, in the way a call is made, in the way a door is left unlocked.
While Nicole sat in the interview room, detectives moved on Brian and Andrew. They didn't run, they didn't fight, but in Brian's apartment, buried under a pile of laundry, they found a hoodie stained in something dark. And in Andrew's home, wedged behind a dresser drawer, a pair of jeans with blood still fresh enough to test. Daniel's blood. It was the thread that tied it all together. Daniel's bruises, the gunshot, the dreadlock, Nicole's call, Misty's testimony, the shaky voice, the silence. One story, 3 people, a plan no one admitted to, but everyone played a part in. The tests came back faster than expected. The stain on Andrew Huber's jeans wasn't motor oil. It wasn't wine or rust. It was Daniel Rayburn's blood. Cold, clean, conclusive. The evidence didn't scream. It whispered certainty. And that whisper was louder than any denial Nicole could offer now. Andrew was arrested without resistance. He barely spoke during transport. Not a word when the cuffs clicked. Just a slow breath, like someone bracing for a storm they knew had been building for too long. Brian Francis was next. His demeanor was different, edgy, twitching with the rhythm of denial. But the line connecting him to Nicole was too direct to ignore. He didn't need to confess. He was already inside the story. The charges came swiftly. Andrew Huber, first-degree murder. Brian Francis, accessory before the fact. Nicole Woodard, conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to murder. The weight of those words settled heavy. But this wasn't just a legal case. It was a tapestry, stitched with phone calls, fear, bruises, unspoken intentions, and the slow decay of a marriage that had already bled out long before the body hit the lawn. Back in the interview room, Nicole sat in a chair bolted to the floor. The silence between questions grew longer. The room smelled like paper, dust, and something unnameable, like regret. She no longer fought the timeline, no longer denied the phone calls. She just refused to label her decisions with names like plan or premeditation. They said they could calm him down. Did you ask them to kill him? No. But you left. You opened the door. I just didn't want to be there anymore. Sometimes guilt doesn't arrive as a confession. It arrives in what's missing, what wasn't said, what wasn't done. She said she went to Misty's house because she didn't know where else to go, because she thought Daniel might have cooled down, because maybe, she hoped, if something did happen, she wouldn't have to witness it. But the moment she left Daniel alone, with 2 men she called after a night of alcohol, fighting, and threats, she made a choice. Not one she shouted, but one she allowed. The prosecutors didn't hesitate. The surveillance footage from across the street showed Nicole leaving in her father's car. The timestamp matched her call log. The neighborhood was quiet. No one else came or went. Daniel had been alive when she left, and dead when she returned. The dreadlock still sat in a sealed evidence bag, its weight heavier than any weapon. Andrew's clothes tested positive. The bruises on Daniel's body matched multiple strikes from more than one person. It was never just her. But it was never not her. In a quiet room off the side of the station, one detective closed his file and stared through the glass. He didn't say it out loud, but the truth sat thick on his chest. They didn't just lose a man on that lawn. They lost a version of Nicole too. The one before the rage, before the calls, before the silence became permission. Love doesn't always die in arguments. Sometimes it dies in the slow decision to walk away and let someone else finish what you couldn't. The walls of the cell were the same as every other, pale, scratched, windowless. But to Nicole, they felt like the inside of her own head. Quiet, pinned down, echoing things she didn't want to hear.
They hadn't formally convicted her yet. But guilt doesn't wait for verdicts. It creeps in through memory. It sits in the corners of the room. It turns sleep into a trial of its own. She lay on the bench and stared at the ceiling. No books, no sounds, just the distant buzz of fluorescent light and the dull ache of her own heartbeat. When the detectives returned to question her again, she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She looked tired, like someone who had finally run out of stories to tell herself. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said. "I just didn't know how to stop him." But what she couldn't explain, what she wouldn't name, was the moment it stopped being fear and started becoming permission. The texts, the call, the silence, the way she'd told Misty that someone was coming, the way she packed a bag. She hadn't left the house in a rush. She'd walked out, closed the door, didn't call the police, didn't warn anyone, didn't come back until hours later, after the lawn had gone quiet. In the DA's office, prosecutors went over every thread. The evidence was airtight around Andrew. His clothes, his silence, his known connection to Nicole. Brian's case was less clean, but the call records, Misty's statement, and Nicole's own words were more than enough to draw the line. And then there was Nicole. Not the killer, not the one who pulled the trigger, but the one who called them in. The law had names for that. Accessory before the fact. Conspiracy to commit murder. Participation through intent or omission. She hadn't struck the blow, but she'd lit the match. And now she was standing in the middle of the fire. Back in the station, Nicole folded into herself. The silence stretched on. Her hands curled tight in her lap, as if holding something too fragile to name. "He hit me once," she whispered. "He shoved me, called me things I didn't recognize, made me small." The detective across from her didn't blink. He let the words hang. "I don't know when it changed," she went on. "Maybe I stopped seeing him as a person. And maybe, somewhere in that breaking, she let the worst idea take root. I just wanted him gone." She said it like a prayer. Not angry, not proud, just quiet, like the words had been waiting their turn. Sometimes justice doesn't feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like sifting through ash, hoping something unburned remains. Nicole would be booked, processed. A trial would follow. The courtroom would fill with voices louder than hers. Facts, footage, fingerprints, and silence. Because that was the thing about this story. The guilt wasn't in the gun. It was in the silence that came before it. There was no dramatic music, no slamming doors or gasps from a crowd. The courtroom wasn't built for theatrics. It was made of wood and silence, rules and repetition. But when Nicole Woodard was led through the side entrance in handcuffs, the air inside shifted. She didn't look defiant. She didn't look guilty either. She looked like someone who had lived too long inside her own head, where every word she said echoed back with a question mark. The prosecution came prepared. Their evidence spoke louder than any witness ever could. The phone calls, the surveillance footage, the bloody jeans, Misty Edge's testimony, the dreadlock found near Daniel's body. Each piece stacked like bricks, not enough to bury her maybe, but enough to wall her in. The defense leaned heavily on Nicole's past, her arguments with Daniel, the emotional bruises, the late-night fights. They painted her as a woman cornered by a man she no longer trusted, a woman who reached out for help in the only way she knew how. But what they couldn't explain, what no one could, was the silence. The silence after the calls, the silence when the door closed behind her, the silence as Daniel lay dying on the lawn. The jury listened closely. They took notes, studied the timelines, watched Nicole closely whenever her name came up. And Nicole? She watched her own story from the inside out, heard it retold in tones she didn't recognize, heard her voice played back on recordings, short, breathless, urgent. And beneath the courtroom lights, she started to break. Not all at once, not in tears, but in the small ways that people fracture. The twitch in her fingers, the way her shoulders curled, the long stares at the floor as though the truth might be hiding in the grain. Misty took the stand. She didn't look at Nicole. She told the court what she had told the police. That Nicole had shown up panicked, that she had handed off bags and talked about Daniel in the past tense, that she had said someone was coming to deal with him. And then she said the thing that quieted even the judge's breath. She said she wanted him gone. She said she needed it to stop. And she didn't ask me to call for help. The courtroom held that line in its teeth. The prosecutor didn't need to ask much after that. The jury had heard enough. Nicole's attorney argued for context, for pain, for history, for survival instincts warped by fear. But the truth was this: pain does not cancel out choice, fear does not wash away the timeline, and silence, deliberate, chosen silence, leaves fingerprints too. The courtroom grew colder as the days stretched on, not in temperature, but in mood. Eyes grew heavier, notes shorter, the air more still. It was no longer about emotion or theory or sympathy. It was about the story that could be proven. 12 jurors sat behind polished rails watching everything, not just the exhibits and evidence, but the spaces between. They watched Nicole's stillness, the way she folded her hands, unfolded them, then folded them again. They watched Misty's discomfort, her careful words, her inability to look at her former friend when she described the morning after Daniel's murder. They watched the detective replay the call logs line by line. July 4th, midnight. Nicole to Brian. Nicole to Andrew. Nicole's location when she left. The silence from her phone afterward. The prosecutor moved slowly, never theatrical, just steady, like someone walking across a frozen lake, knowing the ice might break. But it never did. She didn't shoot him, he said, but she called the men who did. And then she walked away. That was the line that stuck. The defense focused on pain, on survival. They said Nicole lived in fear, that she had no intention for anyone to die, that she only wanted distance, silence, peace. But the jury didn't need to decide whether Nicole was afraid. They needed to decide what she did with that fear, and what she didn't do. No 911 call, no warning, no effort to return, no shock when she found Daniel, no collapse, just a seizure at Applebee's and a quiet ride to Misty's house with a bag full of questions. Pain matters, but so do patterns, and this pattern was clear. Nicole didn't testify. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe the silence had grown too big inside her. Maybe the words no longer sounded like hers. She sat quietly each day, hair pulled back, jaw tight. When they showed the photo of Daniel's body, she didn't cry, but her eyes didn't look away. It wasn't that she didn't feel something. It was that no one knew what it was. And by now, maybe neither did she. The closing arguments came on a Thursday. Outside, the clouds were low, heavy, like the sky knew what was coming. Inside, the jury listened one final time. She made the calls, the prosecutor said, and then she walked away. That is not fear. That is intent. Then came silence. The courtroom emptied. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, and Nicole sat with her palms flat against the defense table, her fingers trembling so faintly you could almost mistake it for cold. But it wasn't cold. It was the weight of everything finally pressing down. The jury was out for nearly 9 hours. No shouting, no slamming of doors, just the hum of whispers in the courthouse halls and the rhythmic passing of time. It ticked differently now, thicker, slower, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Nicole didn't speak during those hours. She didn't pace. She didn't weep. She sat still, hands folded in her lap, her gaze set on a blank corner of the floor that had nothing to offer her. The courtroom remained half lit, half empty. Officers leaned against walls. A clerk shuffled paper. A bailiff stood like a statue, arms crossed, eyes forward. And then, softly without drama, a voice called from the hallway. The jury has reached a verdict. No gasps, no sudden movement, just chairs pulled in quietly. Lawyers returned to their seats. Nicole stood slowly, her wrists trembling just enough to notice. The judge entered. The court rose. The seal of the state gleamed behind the bench. It was time. The foreman, an older man with steady hands and tired eyes, held the envelope without shaking. He looked forward, not at Nicole, not at the press in the gallery, just into the space where justice lives. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, he read, we find the defendant guilty. Nicole didn't flinch. On the charge of accessory before the fact, guilty. Still no tears, no outburst. Just the quietest breath, drawn in through her nose, held too long, and released as though it had been trapped there for days. Daniel's family didn't cheer. They didn't cry either. They just nodded. A small, solemn gesture, like setting down a photograph you've stared at for too long. The courtroom emptied slowly. People filed out without words. Nicole remained standing, her expression unreadable. Outside, the sky was pale. The air was still. The city didn't know what had just happened inside that room. But Nicole knew. She knew the silence had finally spoken, and its words had weight. She was sentenced weeks later, years that would stack on years. Not life, but not short either. Enough to take the middle from her life and lock it away. Enough to change her name from wife to widow to inmate. The courtroom was quieter that day. No reporters, no arguments, just judgment and echo. Nicole Woodard didn't cry when they led her away. She didn't look back, didn't stumble. Her steps were slow, even, rehearsed, like she had walked this hallway 100 times before, even if only in her mind. The courtroom emptied behind her. Daniel Rayburn was still dead. The verdict had not changed that. The trial had not reversed time. Justice doesn't mend, it holds. It preserves the outline of a wound without ever closing it. Back at her cell, the world didn't look different, but Nicole did. She sat with her knees pulled up again, like she had that first night. Her eyes didn't wander anymore. She didn't ask for news or updates or second chances. She simply sat, and in that stillness the truth breathed all around her. Daniel Rayburn had been a man with faults. He was loud, impulsive, proud, but he didn't deserve to die on the lawn of his own home, alone, bruised and bleeding into the dirt. He had loved Nicole in his way. She had feared him in hers, and somewhere between love and fear, something dark took root, something unspoken that became action, and action that became silence, and silence that became death. Not with a scream, but with a phone call. A door closed behind her. A body left to the sky. Brian Francis pled out. Andrew Huber stood trial and was convicted. Their roles were written in blood, in dreadlocks, in the bruises mapped across Daniel's skin. But it was Nicole who started the clock. Nicole who left the house. Nicole who returned after the air had gone still and the grass had taken its witness. And in that gap, between departure and return, a man died. Years passed. The headlines faded. Nicole's name slipped from the front pages and into files. But some stories don't disappear. They just grow quiet. They whisper in places no one looks, beneath bed sheets, between voicemail lines, behind the eyes of those who remember. And Nicole, she learned how to live with silence because silence was the only thing that stayed. In the end, there were no heroes in this story. No redemption arcs. Just a man buried, a woman behind glass, and a neighborhood still watching their lawns a little more closely than before. Prison doesn't begin with a clang. It begins with forgetting. Nicole Woodard arrived at the intake facility with her head down, wrists loose in chain, name whispered rather than called. She didn't struggle. She didn't speak. Her identity wasn't taken from her, but it was folded into a number, filed and worn like an undershirt beneath the orange. She was no longer defendant. She was just inmate #07316. The walls here didn't talk like the ones back home. There were no framed pictures, no hallway arguments, no porch to pace. Just noise in the mornings, silence at night, and the sound of time dragging its feet down every corridor. In her first few months, Nicole barely ate. She answered questions with one-word replies. Didn't fight, didn't complain, didn't ask to call anyone. Her bunkmate said she slept with her eyes half open, like someone waiting for a voice that never came. She didn't cry. The guards said they almost wanted her to, but she never did. Not when they read her sentence. Not when she was processed. Not when the calendar flipped its first cold winter month. They began calling her Ghost. Not because she vanished, but because she lingered weightless in every room. But time softens even stone. By her second year, Nicole worked in the laundry unit. She folded sheets with the precision of someone who didn't want to think. Her hands never trembled anymore. Her eyes stayed forward. Sometimes she would hum. No words, just tones. Half melodies of songs she couldn't finish. Familiar and broken. She had no visitors. No one called. Only one letter ever came. And she never opened it. Just tucked it beneath the mattress like it might burn if read aloud. In therapy, she spoke only once. The counselor asked about Daniel. Nicole blinked. Her voice came low. He hated the quiet. The counselor didn't respond. She didn't need to. Nicole's whole life had become quiet, and for once, no one was shouting. There were moments, brief, accidental, when her face softened. Like when the light hit the wall a certain way in winter, or when she passed the prison chapel and caught the scent of old wood and dust. She never attended services, but sometimes she stood outside, not to pray, just to feel a silence that didn't punish her. Years passed. Her hair grayed early. Her eyes lost none of their depth, but all of their reach. She wrote no letters, left no message. Her name faded from court files, from whispers, from headlines. But inside, her mind still wandered back to the lawn. Not the gunshot, not the blood, but the moment before it all began. The last step out of the house, the door closing behind her. That pause, that choice, that silence. Misty Edge still lived in the same house, same porch, same tired swing, same creaky floorboard by the door she never got around to fixing. But something had changed. Not in the walls, not in the street, but in the silence that came with her name. She didn't like talking about Nicole. She never said that out loud, of course. People in town had questions, some spoken, most not. Misty knew the look, the tilt of the head, the pause before a handshake. You were friends with her, weren't you? She was. She had been. And that's what hurt the most. She remembered that morning, the one that split her life in half, like it happened yesterday. Nicole on her doorstep, shoulders hunched, eyes wild, bags in her hand, words spinning like a broken tape. He's gone. I didn't mean for it. I just wanted help. At the time, Misty didn't know what to do. She let her in, gave her tea, let her sleep, didn't ask too many questions. But after Nicole left, after the police came, Misty replayed every second in her head like a prayer. What had she missed? What had she ignored? Had she known deep down? Had she seen something she chose not to name? When the trial began, Misty sat outside the courthouse for 20 minutes before she could walk in. Her palms wouldn't stop sweating. Her chest ached. She wasn't the one on trial, but it felt like a verdict was waiting for her, too. Testifying was simple in structure. Stand, speak, leave. But it broke something open she didn't know was still sealed. She said the words, "Nicole told me she wanted him gone. She brought me the bags." She looked like she'd already said goodbye. And when she stepped off the stand, she felt like she'd thrown a rope across a canyon and then cut it herself. Some nights, Misty dreamed of Nicole, not the courtroom Nicole, not the cold one in the papers, the old one, laughing over drinks, whispering secrets about crushes they had, dancing barefoot in her living room, eating cheap takeout at midnight after long shifts. That Nicole still lived in her memory, and that was the hardest part, because the friend she loved hadn't vanished. She had transformed into someone she could no longer recognize. And yet, Misty still missed her. Sometimes guilt doesn't come from what you did. Sometimes it comes from what you didn't see, what you didn't say, the door you didn't close, the silence you didn't question. Misty wasn't a killer. She wasn't a conspirator. She was a witness to someone she thought she knew, until that person asked her to forget how knowing works. Now, when Misty passed the courthouse or heard someone mention Daniel's name, her hands instinctively curled, not in fear, but in ache. She had spoken the truth, but the truth didn't bring peace. It just brought weight, a weight she'd carry, quietly, always. In the end, there were no parades, no headlines screaming closure, no faces smiling behind podiums, shaking hands and announcing justice as if it were a ribbon to be cut. Because some stories don't end. They just quiet. They fade not into triumph, but into the slow settling of consequence, like dust in the beams of a courtroom window long after the seats are empty. Daniel Rayburn is still gone. A father, a son, a man not without flaw, but still undeserving of the cold ground he was left on. His grave sits under a tree now, carved with a date that comes too soon, and a name too heavy for a tomb that small. His family still visits. They don't bring balloons or candles, just flowers and silence. Sometimes his sister kneels, sometimes she just stands, but always she listens, because some part of her still waits to hear his voice in the wind. Nicole's name no longer echoes in the streets the way it once did. The story that once gripped the community now rests in old files and faded memories. But inside her cell, time has not moved on. It ticks slow, sharp. She wakes to the same clanging bell, folds the same sheets, walks the same hallways. And every now and then, when the sun is low and the noise dies down, she thinks not of the trial, or the evidence, or the faces that watched her fall. She thinks of the door, that moment, the pause, the last second when she could have turned back, but didn't. Outside the prison gates, the world spins. Lawnmowers buzz, children laugh, people argue and reconcile and forget how rare forgiveness really is. And in that world, Misty Edge still wakes early, still drinks her coffee on the porch Nicole once sat on, still answers the questions no one asks anymore. But in her heart, there's a name she whispers sometimes, not to forgive, not to justify, but to remember that once, before everything, there was a friend she trusted, and that friend chose silence. Justice came in sentences and verdicts, but grief came in echoes, in the sound of the door that didn't slam, in the call that didn't go to 911, in the life that ended in the grass, in the name that turned to a number, in the friend who didn't see it coming, in the story that wasn't about monsters. but people. And in the silence that followed them all. Because in the end, silence is never empty. It's just full of things we didn't say in time. If this story gripped you, don't just watch. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who still believes silence can't be dangerous. We've got another chilling case coming up tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Until then, stay sharp, stay curious, and remember, every quiet house has a story.